Hi everyone. This video is just really running down or going over what we did last week in the practical session where you were posed this question, which is basically write a program that will accept two integers from the keyboard and print out the sum of those two integers. So that was, I guess, the starting point for the whole lesson. So early on, we noticed that in this description, there's something we need to do twice, which is get integers from the keyboard. So you can see we've got to get two of them. And we noted that getting an integer is tricky because a user might type in a letter even though they're asked to type in an integer. And so we have to handle that sort of thing. So because we had to do it twice and because it was a bit tricky, we decided to isolate the part of this task that involves getting an integer from a keyboard as its own function, and we would call that function return int. So just to give you a sort of flowchart of what we're planning on doing, we can see we've got our main program here, and what we do is we go x equals return int. So now with our new, or with the function that we're going to write called return int, we can just say x equals return int, y equals return int, z equals x plus y, and then we print the sum of them z. And so this is the overall program that we want to write. So that means really our first task began with creating the function return int. So that function will prompt a user to enter an integer into a keyboard, and if the inputted data is not an integer, the function should print out an error, then reprompt the user, and if the data was an integer, it should be returned to the caller. So there are no parameters passed into the function. The function should return an integer, and the name is called return int. So we'll be doing this as a loop, and we'll talk about post-test loops and pre-test loops. But let's have a look at the flowchart for this. So we can see here that we start with asking the user for an input, and then we do a test to say, is it an integer? And we say no at this point. And so we loop around here until we do get an integer, at which point we return it, and that's the end of the function. Now you can see here that we're actually doing the work in the loop first, and then we're doing a test. And this is called a post-test. And you will see it in the pseudocode documentation as being in this format where we're doing a repeat until. Okay, so here we've got the flowchart. Here we've got the pseudocode representing this flowchart, and the format is repeat until. Now that syntax comes from our course specification document, okay, and you need to know this, so you need to memorize this basically. All right, so when we do a post test, processing and then condition comes later. Here the condition comes before the processing. Interesting to note that we don't actually have a repeat until in our Python programming. So we use a trick to get around that. Some languages do have a repeat until. C# has a do, and then the until is you put a do here and then a while down here. But Python doesn't have anything exactly. But let's have a look and see how we would actually code this. So coding return int. So the trick we use actually is while true. Now we discussed this in class. While true means do forever. You could read that as do forever. And so what you can think of doing is that this is going to do forever, and that the question or the test that says whether we're going to exit or not will be buried somewhere in this processing. And so the first thing we do is we say to the user, give us something. Then we try to convert it to an integer, and if it fails, we print out an exception, and we'll keep going around and around. If it's true, we'll pass it. So we're using a couple of tricks here. We're using while true, which means do forever, and we're using try and except. Now, as explained in class, try and except, what it does is that if there's any errors occurring in the code that's inside the try part, instead of the program actually falling over, it will do whatever is in the except part, and it will print invalid input, please try again. So say, for example, we did this line here and the user typed in the letter A, then what would happen is we would be trying to turn A, so we'll put A in here, we'll try and turn it into an int. This statement would fail. And normally, if it wasn't in a try block, then the program would actually fail. But because it's in a try block and it failed, it knows to go down to accept, print invalid input, try again. And you can see that it's just going to go around and around and around. If you typed in the number 1, then it would go, the int of the number 1 is 1, so it would return a 1. So that's how this thing works. So a couple of tricks there really to implement this post-test while loop and also get around the fact that we don't have a specific convert to int function. So that was the second part. And then of course, we've got to, once we've written our function, we actually have to incorporate it into a wider program. And so our flowchart would look something like this, where we can, as mentioned above, we can now just call it and do our calculations, print the output, which is all great. You can see here there's no parameters passed. It returns an integer. Actually, you should say it doesn't return an integer. I would say it outputs an integer. And you can see that this symbol here is output. Also remember, you need to know all these symbols. They are once again in the control document. And so over here we have some code, and the code is basically the same function that we have here, and then it's just saying x equals return int. So x should be an integer, y should be an integer, and then it adds those two together. So that's really what we were working on in class. Hopefully it's confusing because we put in a couple of tricks, but make sure that you're on top of this idea of a post-test and a pre-test in terms of what they mean. Here you can see that the pre-test, the condition is up the top. Here you can see that a post-test, the condition is down the bottom. And you should know that in Python, and while we can do this in pseudocode with a repeat until, and if it was a pre-test, you'd do a while loop. And in Python, you should know that to get around the fact that we don't really have a repeat until, what they do is they do a while true, which means do forever. And then the exit is down here somewhere in the processing. I hope you learned a little bit from this video. I'll see you in the next one.